Vampire King was having dinner with his fiancée and in-laws until a waitress whispered, "Run now." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a typical evening at the lavish restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. The chandeliers hung low, casting a soft glow over the exquisite dining tables, each set with fine china and crystal goblets filled with the most expensive wine. At the center of it all sat the Vampire King, his regal presence almost as ancient as the building itself. His fiancée, a beautiful woman with a smile that could light up the entire room, sat beside him, her eyes never leaving his as they engaged in polite conversation with his in-laws. The table was a perfect picture of nobility, wealth, and power. Yet, beneath the surface, there was something unsettling about the evening. The Vampire King could feel it, a disturbance in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't just the tension between his fiancée and her family that caused the unease. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. He had lived for centuries, had seen more than his fair share of threats, but tonight felt different. His sharp gaze flicked around the room, scanning every face, every movement, every flicker of emotion. It was the waitress that caught his attention. She was nothing like the others, nervous, unsure, yet there was something in her eyes that made the Vampire King pause. She wasn't just a servant in this grand place. No, she was more than that. He could sense it. The way she moved, the way she held herself, even her hesitation as she approached his table. She was different, and the Vampire King had learned long ago that when something felt different, it usually meant danger was lurking nearby. As the evening continued, the Vampire King's unease only grew. His fiancée and her family continued their conversation, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface of their opulent dinner. Then, as the tension in the air reached its peak, the waitress leaned in closer, her eyes wide with fear. She whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "Run now." The words were simple, but the gravity of them hit the Vampire King like a blow to the chest. His heart, which had not felt true fear in centuries, skipped a beat. Without a moment's hesitation, he stood, his hand gripping the table as he scanned the room once again. He knew, instinctively, that whatever was coming was not just a threat to him, but to everyone in this room. The Vampire King's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the waitress's warning. Was it an attack? Was someone trying to harm his fiancée, his in-laws? Or was it something even worse? The answer came to him in a flash. The enemies of the Vampire King were not just after him anymore. They had found a way to target everyone he cared about. The warning had come too late. The danger was already here, and it was only a matter of time before it made its move. The Vampire King locked eyes with the waitress, his face expressionless, but his mind was already calculating the next steps. The fiancée, oblivious to the change in the atmosphere, smiled and reached for her wine. But the Vampire King knew better. He had faced enemies before, but tonight, things were different. His fiancée and her family were about to be dragged into a world of danger they could never have imagined. The Vampire King's heart raced as he stood, his instincts kicking into high gear. The words of the waitress echoed in his mind, "Run now." His cold eyes scanned the room, the tension thickening in the air like a storm on the horizon. His fiancée, oblivious to the shift in energy, continued chatting with her family, but the Vampire King was no longer focused on her. His thoughts raced, and his sharp senses were on high alert. Every small movement, every whisper, every sound became magnified in the depths of his awareness. The room was still, yet it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. The sense of dread had settled into his bones, and he could feel something creeping closer, something dangerous. He could not shake the feeling that whoever had orchestrated this attack was close, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. His mind flashed back to the old days, to the countless battles, the enemies who had tried to bring him down. But this was different. This wasn't just about power or politics. This was about something more. The waitress had known, she had sensed it, and for some reason, she had warned him. That made everything more complicated. He had never been one to trust easily, especially not a mere servant. But her words had carried weight. He turned to face her, and their eyes locked for the briefest moment. She was trembling, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched the tray, her expression one of pure fear. It was clear to the Vampire King that she wasn't part of the plot, but her warning, her reaction, had given her far more importance than she had ever anticipated. He needed answers, and he needed them quickly. Without hesitation, he motioned for his guards, who had been silently standing at attention, to follow him. As he made his way toward the back of the room, his gaze never left the waitress. He could hear the subtle murmurs of the guests behind him, whispers of confusion and concern, but he ignored them. The only thing that mattered now was the imminent threat. The Vampire King's fiancée, still unaware of the danger, was now looking toward him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice soft. But he didn't answer. His mind was already calculating, formulating the next steps. The room seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere thicker as they moved deeper into the corridor. He could feel the presence of the enemy drawing near. He couldn't afford to be distracted any longer. "Run now," the waitress had said. But where would they run? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate steps. The Vampire King's hand instinctively moved to his side, where his weapon of choice, a beautifully crafted silver dagger, was secured. He was ready. He had to be. The sound grew louder, and then he saw them. A group of men dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with purpose, their eyes cold, calculating. These were no ordinary enemies. These were vampires, but not like him. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their presence felt off, almost twisted. They were the ones who had been hunting him. He had heard rumors of a rogue faction of vampires, ones who had grown disillusioned with the old ways and sought to create their own path of destruction. And now, they had come for him. The Vampire King drew his dagger, his grip firm. His instincts screamed at him to strike first, to end this threat before it could escalate, but he held back. His fiancée and her family were still in the main hall, vulnerable. He couldn't risk exposing them to the chaos about to unfold. He turned to one of his guards, his voice low and commanding. "Get them out of here. Make sure they're safe." The guard nodded and moved quickly, ushering the fiancée and her family away from the danger. The Vampire King's heart clenched as he watched them disappear into the corridor, but there was no time to hesitate. He had to act. With a swift motion, he lunged at the first of the attackers, his dagger flashing in the dim light. The rogue vampire barely had time to react before the blade sank deep into his side. But the fight had only just begun. More attackers emerged from the shadows, surrounding the Vampire King. He fought back with all his might, his ancient strength allowing him to overpower each one. But there were too many. He could feel his energy draining, and his mind raced to find a way out. And then, out of nowhere, he heard it again. "Run now." The waitress's voice, so clear and distinct, cut through the chaos. He didn't know why, but he trusted her. Without another thought, he broke through the circle of attackers, his movements swift and fluid. The rogue vampires tried to follow, but the Vampire King was already gone, his fiancée's safety his only concern. As he sprinted down the corridor, he could hear the footsteps of the attackers echoing behind him, but he didn't stop. The only thing that mattered was getting out. He had to protect his fiancée, and he had to find a way to stop the rogue vampires once and for all. The Vampire King's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed through the narrow corridor, his mind whirling with the urgent need to protect his fiancée and stop the rogue vampires. The hallways of the castle were dimly lit, the faint flicker of candlelight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like ghostly fingers, as if the very walls were closing in around him. His breath came in heavy gasps as he ran, his thoughts fixed on one goal, getting his fiancée and her family to safety. The warning from the waitress, "Run now," still echoed in his mind. He didn't know why he trusted her, but something deep inside told him that the danger was far greater than just an attack on him. The rogue vampires had come for more than his crown. They had come for his legacy. As he rounded a corner, his sharp senses detected movement ahead. His body tensed, every muscle coiled for action. He was no longer in the mood for games. The time for subtlety was over. Without hesitation, he drew his sword, the blade shimmering in the low light, and he prepared himself for whatever was waiting around the corner. The Vampire King's instincts were spot on. As he moved forward, a group of the rogue vampires appeared, blocking the passage. There were 5 of them, each dressed in dark, almost ritualistic clothing, their faces covered by masks that only revealed cold, glowing eyes. Their power radiated in the air, an aura of pure malevolence. These weren't the typical vampires he had encountered over the centuries. They were different, stronger, faster, more vicious. One of the rogue vampires, the leader, stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the Vampire King with a mixture of disdain and amusement. "So, you finally show your true face," the leader said in a low, venomous voice. "It's time for you to step down, King. Your reign is over." The Vampire King's grip on his sword tightened, his jaw clenched in anger. He had seen many enemies in his long life, but these vampires were unlike anything he had ever faced before. There was a hunger in their eyes, an eagerness to destroy him that was almost palpable. "You've made a mistake," the Vampire King said, his voice cold and steady. "This will be your last one." With a roar, the rogue vampires lunged at him, their movements too fast to follow. But the Vampire King was faster. He met their attack head-on, his sword cutting through the air with precision and power. The first vampire fell with a single strike, but the others were relentless. They attacked from all sides, their fangs bared, claws extended. The Vampire King fought back with everything he had, his sword flashing as he parried and struck with deadly accuracy. But there were too many of them. His energy was beginning to wane. He needed to end this, and quickly. As the battle raged on, his mind raced. He couldn't allow these rogue vampires to take control of his castle. He couldn't let them harm his fiancée and her family. Every strike he made was driven by the fear that they were still in danger, that they could be taken at any moment. With a burst of energy, the Vampire King swung his sword in a wide arc, knocking 2 of the attackers off their feet. He seized the opportunity and moved swiftly, taking out another rogue vampire with a swift strike to the chest. But the leader was still standing, his glowing eyes locked onto the Vampire King. The 2 of them circled each other, each waiting for the other to make a move. "You're nothing but a relic of the past," the leader sneered. "You've outlived your usefulness. It's time for someone else to rule." The Vampire King's eyes narrowed. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and filled with fury. "This castle is mine, and I will die defending it." With that, he charged at the rogue leader, his sword raised high. The clash was deafening. Steel against steel, the sound of battle echoed through the corridor. The rogue leader fought with all his strength, but the Vampire King was stronger, his centuries of experience giving him the edge. With one final, powerful strike, the Vampire King drove his sword through the leader's chest, the rogue vampire's body collapsing to the ground. The other rogue vampires, seeing their leader fall, hesitated for a moment. That was all the Vampire King needed. He moved quickly, his sword cutting down the remaining attackers one by one. When the last of the rogue vampires fell, the Vampire King stood alone in the corridor, breathing heavily, his sword dripping with blood. The fight was over, but the battle for his legacy was far from finished. He turned and sprinted back down the hallway, his mind focused on his fiancée and her family. They had to be safe. The rogue vampires may have been defeated, but the threat too. His kingdom was far from gone. The Vampire King's boots echoed through the dimly lit hallways as he sprinted, his mind racing with the need to reach his fiancée and her family. His sword was still gripped tightly in his hand, his body tense with the weight of the battle he had just fought. The rogue vampires were no longer a threat, but something much darker loomed over his kingdom. He knew that the attack was just the beginning, a warning of something far more dangerous. His fiancée was still in the castle, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As he rounded the corner, his mind flashed to her soft smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she looked at him. He had never let anyone get close, never allowed himself to feel vulnerable. But with her, it was different. He cared for her, deeply. The sound of his footsteps echoed louder as he approached the main hall, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to be sure that she was safe. The castle's doors loomed ahead, their ornate wood panels glowing faintly in the candlelight. He was almost there when he heard a sudden crash from within. His body tensed, and he immediately moved faster, pushing himself forward with renewed urgency. As he entered the hall, the sight that greeted him took his breath away. The fiancée and her family were standing near the far wall, backed into a corner, surrounded by shadows. A figure stood in front of them, dark and menacing. It was one of the rogue vampires, the very leader who had fallen earlier. But how? The Vampire King's instincts flared. There was something wrong about this. He had killed the leader, and yet here he was, alive, with a dark aura surrounding him. The rogue vampire's eyes glowed with an eerie red light, his body crackling with unnatural energy. "You," the Vampire King growled, his voice filled with fury. "You should be dead." The rogue vampire's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "This is only the beginning. You cannot stop what is coming." The Vampire King's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? The rogue vampire's eyes flicked to the fiancée and her family, a malicious glint in his gaze. "You're all pawns," he sneered. "Just pieces in a much larger game. The real power lies with the one who controls you, and I am that one." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Vampire King's grip on his sword tightened, his anger boiling over. He moved forward, stepping between the rogue vampire and the fiancée, his body a shield. "Stay away from them," the Vampire King warned, his voice low and dangerous. The rogue vampire laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "You think you can protect them? You think you can protect anyone? You're already too late." He raised his hand, and with a snap of his fingers, the room seemed to shake. The shadows around them shifted, forming into dark, twisted figures, more rogue vampires, each one stronger than the last. The fiancée gasped, clutching her family to her. The Vampire King's eyes widened as he realized the true threat. These were not just rogue vampires, they were something more. Dark magic had been used to bring them back to life, and now they were under the control of the rogue leader. The Vampire King's heart raced as he assessed the situation. He could fight them, but there were too many, and with the fiancée and her family so close, he couldn't risk making a mistake. He needed to think, to find a way to defeat the rogue vampires and protect everyone. As he scanned the room, his eyes locked onto the waitress, the same woman who had warned him earlier. She was standing at the edge of the room, her expression one of quiet determination. For a moment, their eyes met, and the Vampire King felt something stir inside him. She was not afraid. She knew what needed to be done. The Vampire King nodded slightly, a silent agreement passing between them. "Get them out of here," he said to his guards, his voice steady and commanding. "I will deal with this." The guards moved quickly, ushering the fiancée and her family toward the back of the room, their eyes wide with fear. But the Vampire King knew they would be safe for now. He turned his attention back to the rogue vampires. With a flick of his wrist, he summoned his dark magic, the power coursing through his veins like fire. "You won't get away with this," the Vampire King said, his voice cold and filled with an intensity that could not be matched. "This ends now." The rogue vampire's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But it was too late. The Vampire King unleashed a wave of power, sending the rogue vampires flying across the room. The walls shook as the magic crackled in the air, filling the room with an energy so intense it was almost unbearable. The rogue vampire growled, his body writhing in pain as the magic took hold. But the Vampire King wasn't finished yet. He moved forward, his sword flashing in the dim light, and with one swift motion, he drove the blade through the rogue vampire's chest. The battle was over. The rogue vampires fell to the ground, their bodies crumpling into the shadows. The Vampire King stood tall, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but his mind still alert. The threat was gone, but the danger was far from over. He turned toward the waitress, his eyes filled with gratitude. She had played a part in this victory, and he knew that they would need each other in the battles to come. The Vampire King stood in the aftermath of the battle, his breath ragged, his body aching from the fierce combat. The rogue vampires had been vanquished, but a new, even more dangerous threat had emerged from the shadows. He looked around the room, the faint light from the flickering candles casting an eerie glow across the crumpled bodies of his fallen enemies. His grip on his sword tightened, but there was a sense of relief. For now, the danger had passed. But the Vampire King knew that this was only a brief reprieve. He could feel it in his bones. The rogue vampire leader had made it clear that this was just the beginning. The true enemy was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. His fiancée, still shaken by the events, had been escorted to a safe room along with her family. The Vampire King had ensured their safety, but he couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that something wasn't right. He needed to know who was behind the attack and why they had targeted his family. The waitress stood to his side, her expression one of quiet resolve. She had played a crucial role in the battle, warning him just in time, and he owed her his gratitude. But there was more to her than met the eye. Her calm demeanor in the face of such danger spoke of a strength that he had not expected. As the last of the rogue vampires crumbled to the ground, the Vampire King turned to her, his voice low but filled with appreciation. "You've proven yourself to be more than just a servant," he said, his gaze never leaving her. "I owe you my life." She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "I'm not looking for thanks," she replied softly. "I did what had to be done." The Vampire King's mind raced. He had learned not to trust easily, but there was something about her, something that felt familiar, even though they had only just met. His instincts, honed over centuries of experience, were telling him that she was more than just a bystander in this story. There was a connection between them, something deeper than he could explain. "I don't understand," the Vampire King said, his voice almost a whisper. "How did you know?" She glanced around the room, her expression unreadable. "I've been watching," she said, her voice steady. "I've been keeping an eye on the castle for some time. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know when." The Vampire King narrowed his eyes. "You've been watching the castle? What?" She hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer. "Because I'm not just some servant. I have my own reasons for being here." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The Vampire King's mind raced. What was she hiding? What was her connection to all of this? Before he could ask another question, the door to the room opened, and one of his guards stepped inside. "My lord," the guard said, his voice urgent. "There's news. The fiancée and her family are safe, but we've discovered something disturbing. The rogue vampires were just the beginning. There's a larger force at work here." The Vampire King's heart sank. He had known it was too easy. He had dealt with the immediate threat, but the real battle was just beginning. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice sharp. "What have you discovered?" The guard hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "We've intercepted messages from an underground faction of vampires. They're planning something far more dangerous. The rogue vampires were only pawns in their game. There's a power struggle within the vampire world, and it's coming for you, my lord." The Vampire King's mind raced. A power struggle? It all made sense now. The rogue vampires hadn't been working alone. They had been part of something much larger. He turned to the waitress, his eyes hardening. "Who are they?" he demanded. She met his gaze with a steady, unwavering look. "They're the remnants of an old order," she said quietly. "An order that wants to reclaim the throne, to overthrow the current vampire monarchy." The Vampire King's jaw tightened. "And what do they want from me?" She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want everything," she said, her eyes darkening. "Your kingdom, your throne, your power. They want to take it all, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." The Vampire King's fists clenched. He had faced many challenges over the centuries, but this was different. This wasn't just about power or politics. This was about survival. His survival, and the survival of everything he had built. "I won't let them take it," he said, his voice cold with determination. "I'll fight to the last breath." The waitress nodded, her expression grim. "I know," she said softly. "But you'll need more than just strength to defeat them. You'll need allies. You'll need to be smarter than they are." The Vampire King's eyes flicked to her. "And you?" he asked. "What role do you play in all of this?" She paused, then looked at him with a mixture of resolve and something else, something he couldn't quite place. "I play the role of someone who's not afraid to face the darkness," she said. "Someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to stop them." The Vampire King nodded slowly. He could see it now. She wasn't just a servant. She was something more. Someone he could trust. And with her by his side, he might just have a chance at surviving the storm that was about to hit. The Vampire King stood in the center of the chamber, his mind racing as the weight of the situation settled over him. His kingdom was at risk, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. The rogue vampires were just the beginning, but the larger faction behind them was a threat unlike any he had ever faced before. The waitress, who had once been just another face in the crowd, was now a key player in this deadly game. He didn't fully understand her motives, but he knew one thing for certain. She had saved him, and in doing so, had earned his trust. The flickering light from the torches on the walls danced across her face, casting shadows that made her look even more enigmatic. She stood beside him, silent but determined, waiting for his next move. His mind shifted to his fiancée and her family, now safely secured in another part of the castle. They were out of harm's way, for now, but how long would that last? The rogue vampires had struck, and he couldn't risk their lives again. He needed a plan. "We need to strike first," the Vampire King said, his voice low and filled with resolve. "But we can't do it alone." The waitress nodded, her eyes focused on him with a quiet intensity. "I know someone who can help," she replied, her voice steady. "But it won't be easy. They'll want something in return." The Vampire King raised an eyebrow. "Who is this person?" The waitress hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering toward the door. "An ally from my past. Someone who owes me a favor." The Vampire King frowned. "And you trust them?" "I have no choice," she replied, her voice tinged with a hint of regret. "But trust is something we can't afford to be picky about right now." He studied her for a moment, weighing her words. There was something in her eyes, something hidden beneath the surface, but he didn't press her further. They had bigger things to worry about. "Tell me what we need to do," he said. The waitress took a deep breath and began to explain. "The faction behind the rogue vampires is far-reaching. They've been operating in the shadows for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. They're organized, powerful, and they won't stop until they have what they want." The Vampire King nodded. "Which is?" "The throne," she said simply. "The power. They want to overthrow you, take your place, and rule the vampire world. And you think this ally of yours can help us stop them?" The waitress's eyes darkened. "I know they can, but it comes at a price. This person has resources, information, connections, but they don't give favors for free." The Vampire King's jaw tightened. He didn't like being in debt to anyone, but he understood the need for alliances in times like this. He couldn't afford to turn down any help. "What do we need to do?" he asked again, his voice firm. "We need to find them," she said, "and we need to make a deal. But first, we'll have to get through the next few days without drawing too much attention to ourselves. The faction won't be the only ones hunting us. There are others who will come after you, others who have no loyalty to anyone but themselves. It's a game of survival now." The Vampire King's mind whirled. The stakes had just gotten higher. It wasn't just about the throne anymore. It was about keeping everything he had worked for, everything he had built, from falling into the hands of those who sought to destroy him. "Then we move carefully," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "We'll strike when the time is right." "And in the meantime?" the waitress asked. "In the meantime, we prepare," the Vampire King said, his eyes darkening with determination. "We gather allies, we make our moves in the shadows, and we don't trust anyone who doesn't have something to gain from helping us. It's time to take back control." The waitress nodded, her expression hardening with the same resolve. "I'll contact the ally. You prepare the castle. We'll need every advantage we can get." The Vampire King turned toward the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape beyond. The night was silent, but he could feel the storm brewing. He could feel the danger drawing closer. And he was ready. With the waitress by his side, with the plan beginning to take shape, he knew that he was not alone in this fight. But the true test was still ahead. There was no going back now. The enemy was coming, and he would do whatever it took to protect his throne, his fiancée, and everything he held dear. As he turned back to the room, his eyes met the waitress's once again. "Let's move quickly," he said. "We don't have much time." And with that, they began to make their preparations for the war that was about to erupt. The Vampire King sat in his private chamber, the weight of the situation settling heavily upon him. The castle was unusually silent, the tension palpable in the air. His thoughts raced, his mind churning with the plans that had been set in motion. The rogue vampires had been eliminated, but the true threat, the force behind the attack, was still out there, lurking in the shadows. He knew that the battle was far from over, and that it was only a matter of time before they would strike again. The fiancée and her family were safe, for now, but how long could he protect them? How long could he keep everyone he cared about out of harm's way? His mind kept returning to the waitress. She had warned him, had been the first to sense the danger, and now, she was an unexpected ally. She had told him about the underground faction, the group of vampires who wanted to overthrow him. But what was her connection to all of this? What had she not told him? He had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that there was more to her story than she was letting on. The door creaked open, and the waitress stepped inside. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, they just stood there, silently regarding each other. "I've made contact with the ally," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "They're willing to help, but there's a catch." The Vampire King raised an eyebrow. "What kind of catch?" "They want to meet in person," she explained. "They won't do anything until they see the situation for themselves." "Where?" The Vampire King's voice was sharp. He didn't have time for games. "There's a safe house in the city," she said. "It's not far from here, but it's hidden. We'll need to be discreet." The Vampire King stood, his body tense with the realization that time was running out. "How soon can we leave?" The waitress hesitated for a moment before answering. "We can leave now, but we'll need to be careful. The faction has eyes everywhere. We can't afford to be seen." "Understood," the Vampire King said, his voice low and filled with determination. "We leave immediately." The two of them made their way through the castle, moving quickly and quietly through the corridors. The guards had been instructed to stand down for now, but the Vampire King knew they would need them again soon. He had no illusions about the danger they were about to face. As they reached the exit, the cool night air hit them, and the Vampire King felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The city was dark, the streets empty at this late hour. The only sound was the soft crunch of their footsteps against the pavement as they walked toward the rendezvous point. The waitress led the way, her pace steady and confident. The Vampire King followed closely behind, his senses heightened, every part of him alert to the potential threat around them. As they neared the safe house, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes scanned the shadows, but he saw nothing. Still, the feeling lingered. They reached the entrance without incident, and the waitress knocked twice, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to blend into the night. The door opened slowly, revealing a figure in the doorway. A man, tall and lean, with a face that seemed too smooth, too perfect to be entirely human. His eyes were dark, but there was a sharpness to them that made the Vampire King wary. "You're late," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "We don't have much time." The waitress didn't flinch. "We've been dealing with other matters," she replied. "The situation's more complicated than we thought." The man stepped aside, allowing them to enter. "I'm aware," he said, his gaze flicking to the Vampire King. "The rogue vampires were just the beginning. The faction is bigger than you realize, and they're not going to stop until they've taken everything." The Vampire King's jaw tightened. "What are we dealing with here?" "An army," the man said flatly. "They've been building it for years. They've infiltrated key positions in the vampire society, in politics, in the military. They're not just after the throne, they're after everything." The Vampire King's mind raced. An army? How could they have been building this force without his knowledge? How had they managed to stay hidden for so long? "Where are they now?" he demanded. "What's their next move?" The man's eyes darkened. "They're preparing for war. And they're coming for you. The question is, are you ready?" The Vampire King's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. He was ready. He had to be. He had fought battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just about power or politics. This was about survival. His survival. "I'll be ready," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. The man nodded. "Then we don't have much time to waste. We need to gather allies, strengthen our defenses, and prepare for the storm that's coming." The Vampire King turned to the waitress, his eyes meeting hers. "Are you ready for this?" She didn't hesitate. "I've been ready my whole life," she said, her voice filled with conviction. The Vampire King nodded. "Then let's finish this." They would face whatever came next, together. The war was only beginning, and the Vampire King was prepared to fight until the very end. The Vampire King stood in the dimly lit safe house, his thoughts focused as the gravity of the situation pressed down on him. His mind replayed the conversation with the mysterious man who had offered his help, his warnings about the underground faction growing ever clearer. The rogue vampires were just a distraction, a diversion for something far more dangerous. An army, an organized group determined to overthrow him and take control of everything he had worked for. His hands clenched into fists at his side, his fingers aching as if they could already feel the weight of the battle ahead. There was no time to waste. The Vampire King had faced countless enemies over the centuries, but this was different. The stakes had never been so high. As he glanced around the safe house, he saw the waitress standing near the entrance, her eyes filled with quiet determination. She had been a constant presence by his side through the chaos, and yet, there was so much more to her than he had initially realized. Her calm composure, her knowledge of the factions, the way she had helped him in the fight, it all added up to something more than mere coincidence. He needed her, and for reasons unknown, she seemed to need him too. But why? What was her true connection to this war? Before he could voice his thoughts, the man who had helped them earlier stepped forward. His expression was grim, his eyes hard. "They're moving faster than we anticipated," he said, his voice grave. "The underground faction has already infiltrated key parts of the city. They're spreading out, organizing, preparing for a strike." The Vampire King's brow furrowed. "What kind of strike?" "They're after the heart of your kingdom," the man replied. "Your power. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything you've built. And they've already made their first move." The Vampire King's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The man gestured toward the window, his eyes scanning the streets outside. "They've already begun attacking your allies. Key families. Influential vampires who've supported you. They're trying to break your alliances, weaken your defenses before they make their final move." The Vampire King's heart sank. His allies, those who had helped him hold his kingdom together, were now targets. The rogue vampires were only the beginning, and now his own people were in danger. "We have to stop them," the Vampire King said, his voice filled with icy resolve. "I'll deal with this. You keep the safe house secure." The man nodded, but before he could respond, the waitress stepped forward, her gaze sharp. "You don't have time to go alone," she said, her voice firm. "If you leave now, they'll know you're coming. It's a trap. You need to be smarter than that." The Vampire King turned to her, his expression unreadable. "And what do you suggest?" "You need to gather the remaining allies you can trust," she said, meeting his gaze with a quiet intensity. "The ones who are still loyal to you. We need to move fast, but we need to do it carefully." The Vampire King was silent for a moment, processing her words. She was right. He couldn't take on the entire faction alone, not without making the situation worse. They needed a plan, and they needed to act quickly before it was too late. He turned back to the man, his mind already calculating their next steps. "Send word to the loyal families. We need to assemble a council," he said, his voice steady. "We need to know who we can count on." The man nodded and left without another word, disappearing into the shadows of the safe house. The Vampire King turned to the waitress once more, his gaze lingering on her. "You've been a great help," he said, his voice softer now, the weight of his words lingering in the air. "But you still haven't told me everything." She didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she met his gaze directly, unflinching. "I have my reasons for keeping certain things to myself," she said. "But I'm here now. That's all that matters. And I'll help you win this war, no matter the cost." Her words were unwavering, her resolve just as strong as his. For the first time in a long while, the Vampire King felt a sense of trust, unspoken, but undeniable. She wasn't just another servant. She was an ally, someone who shared his goals, someone he could rely on when the stakes were at their highest. But even as he accepted this, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than she was letting on. What did she really want? What was her true agenda? The answers would come in time, but for now, there was no time to waste. They had to move quickly. "Then let's make sure we're ready," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We don't have the luxury of waiting any longer." She nodded in agreement, her eyes locking with his. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. The Vampire King turned to face the city beyond the safe house's windows. The storm was coming, and he was ready to face it head-on. The fight for his kingdom, for everything he had ever known, was about to begin in earnest. And this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. He would strike back, and he would do whatever it took to protect those he loved. No one would take his kingdom from him, not while he still had the strength to fight. The Vampire King moved quickly, his thoughts focused and sharp. Time was slipping away, and the rogue vampire faction's influence was growing stronger by the hour. The safe house was quiet now, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. The waitress, now a trusted ally, stood by his side, her quiet determination a steadying force in the chaos. He turned to her, his mind racing through the steps they needed to take. The city had always been a place of secrets and shadows, but now it was more dangerous than ever. Have you heard anything from our allies? He asked, his voice low and controlled. The waitress nodded, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for something hidden in the shadows. Yes, she said. Some of the loyal families have begun to mobilize, but others are still hesitant. The faction's influence is spreading quickly. They've been targeting the weak points, and we can't afford to waste any more time. The Vampire King's jaw tightened. He had known the situation was dire, but hearing the words spoken out loud made it more real, more immediate. The time for hesitation was over. He couldn't wait for all his allies to fall into line. They needed to act, and they needed to act fast. Then we move now, he said, his voice resolute. We can't wait for them to come for us. We have to take the fight to them. The waitress's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was an understanding between them. She didn't hesitate. I'll gather the others, she said, her voice steady. We'll need to move carefully. The faction won't give us an easy fight. The Vampire King nodded, watching as she turned to leave. As the door clicked shut behind her, he felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. He had been through countless battles, but this felt different. This wasn't just about power, it was about survival. His kingdom, his throne, his legacy, all of it was at stake. He had to protect what was his, and he would do whatever it took to make sure that the faction's plan to overthrow him failed. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly as he paced the room, his mind working through every possible scenario. Every step had to be calculated. One wrong move, and everything he had built could come crashing down. He had fought many battles in his long life, but the stakes had never been higher. He had never felt the threat so close, so real. The silence of the room was broken by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. The waitress returned, and behind her, a few familiar faces entered the room. Vampires who had pledged their loyalty to the Vampire King. They were ready to fight, ready to stand beside him in the war that was about to erupt. The Vampire King surveyed the group, his eyes scanning each face, each individual who would fight by his side. These were the ones he could count on. We move tonight, he said, his voice unwavering. The time for waiting is over. We take the fight to them, and we show them that no one takes my kingdom without paying the price. The vampires nodded in agreement, their expressions grim but determined. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. The Vampire King turned to the waitress, who was standing quietly by the door, her gaze fixed on him. You've helped us this far, he said. But now, I need to know, what's your next move? Are you with us in this? The waitress didn't hesitate. I've been with you from the start, she said, her voice firm. And I'll be with you to the end. The Vampire King's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of appreciation passing between them. She was more than just a servant, more than just an ally. There was a bond between them now, forged in the heat of battle and the shared understanding of what they were fighting for. He turned to face the group, his expression hardening once again. Then let's move, he commanded. We take the city, we take the fight to them, and we show them what happens when they mess with the Vampire King. The group of vampires stood tall, ready to follow their leader into the heart of the battle. They knew the risks, but they were willing to die for the cause. The Vampire King knew that not everyone would make it out alive. This was war, and in war, there were always casualties. But they would fight with everything they had. As they made their way toward the door, the Vampire King's thoughts turned to his fiancée and her family. They were safe, for now, but the danger was far from over. He would fight to the death to protect them, but the war was bigger than just his family. It was about the survival of his kingdom, his people, and everything he had built. He had lost too much already. He wasn't going to let it slip away now. The night was dark, the air thick with anticipation as they moved through the streets, preparing for the final confrontation. The rogue vampires would be waiting, but the Vampire King was ready. He had never been more prepared for a fight. This time, he would win. He had to. The Vampire King stood at the head of the group, his senses heightened as they approached the heart of the city. The streets were dark, almost eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The night felt heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with tension, and every step they took brought them closer to the confrontation that would decide the fate of everything he had built. The rogue vampires had made their move, and now it was time to show them that the Vampire King would not go down without a fight. The group of loyal vampires moved silently behind him, their eyes sharp and alert. They were ready, but the Vampire King knew this would be no easy battle. The enemy was waiting, their forces entrenched, and the fight ahead would test them all. But he would not be intimidated. He had faced far worse over the centuries. As they neared the center of the city, the Vampire King felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, a slight unease, but then it became undeniable. He was being watched. He paused for a moment, his senses on high alert. His eyes scanned the shadows, his every muscle tensed, prepared for the inevitable ambush. His hand moved to the hilt of his sword, the cool metal reassuring against his palm. He turned to the waitress, his trusted ally, who was standing beside him. "They're close," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We knew they wouldn't make it easy," she replied. "But we're ready. We've come this far. We finish this tonight." The Vampire King met her gaze, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. She had proven herself time and again, and now, in the heart of this battle, her strength was more valuable than ever. "Stay close," he said. "I'll take the lead. Follow my orders, and we'll win this." With that, they moved forward again, the tension building with each step. They had reached the square, the heart of the city. In the center stood a massive, dark structure, one that had been a symbol of his reign for centuries. Now it was a battleground. The rogue vampires were inside, waiting for them. As the group advanced, the door to the building swung open with a creak, and a chilling silence fell over the area. They were ready. The Vampire King strode forward, his presence commanding, as if every step he took demanded respect. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the knowledge that this fight would determine not just his future, but the future of his kingdom. As they entered the building, they were met with the sight of the rogue vampires, standing in the shadows, their eyes glowing with malice. The leader, a tall, imposing figure, stepped forward, his dark cloak swirling around him like smoke. "So, you've come," the rogue leader said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I was wondering when you would show your face." The Vampire King's eyes narrowed. "I won't let you take my kingdom," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "This ends tonight." The rogue leader smiled, a cold, cruel expression. "You really think you can stop us? We have more power than you can imagine. You're already too late." With a flick of his hand, the rogue leader signaled, and from the shadows emerged more rogue vampires, their numbers seemingly endless. The Vampire King's heart raced as he quickly assessed the situation. The odds were stacked against them, but he would not back down. "We fight together," he said, his voice filled with authority. "We take them down, one by one." The battle began with a sudden, explosive clash. The Vampire King moved with lightning speed, his sword flashing in the dim light as he cut down the first wave of attackers. His loyal followers fought fiercely beside him, their strength and loyalty driving them forward. The rogue vampires were skilled, their movements swift and deadly, but the Vampire King and his allies were not easily deterred. They fought with everything they had, their determination unshakable. The rogue leader watched from the back, his eyes cold and calculating. He knew this battle would not be won easily, but he also knew that victory was within his grasp. "You can't stop us," he taunted, his voice rising over the chaos of the battle. "You've already lost." The Vampire King's eyes locked onto the rogue leader, his anger boiling over. "I haven't lost anything," he growled. "Not yet." With a roar, he charged forward, his sword cutting through the air as he moved toward the rogue leader. The rogue leader smiled, raising his hands to summon more of his dark power, but the Vampire King was faster. With a single, powerful strike, he drove his sword into the rogue leader's chest, the force of the blow sending him crashing to the ground. The room fell silent as the rogue leader's body crumpled, his power extinguished. The remaining rogue vampires hesitated, their morale shattered. By the fall of their leader, the Vampire King turned to face them, his eyes burning with the fire of victory. "You're finished," he said, his voice like ice. "Surrender now, and you may live." The rogue vampires, seeing the strength of their leader's defeat, dropped their weapons and knelt. The battle was over. The Vampire King's victory was hard-won, but it was complete. He turned to the waitress, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper. She had been with him every step of the way, and now, as the dust settled, he knew that she was more than just an ally. She was part of his future, part of the kingdom he would rebuild. Together, they had defeated the greatest threat he had ever faced. But the war was not truly over. The Vampire King knew that the true test of his strength and leadership was still ahead. The kingdom had been saved for now, but rebuilding would take time. And there would always be new challenges to face. But for tonight, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle had been won, and tomorrow they would begin again. The aftermath of the battle was a mix of triumph and tension. The Vampire King stood in the middle of the now silent chamber, his sword still in hand, its edge glinting in the faint light of the room. The rogue vampires had been defeated, their rebellion crushed, but a feeling of uncertainty lingered in the air. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. His kingdom was still vulnerable, and the factions that sought to topple him were far from gone. The Vampire King's eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of those who had fought alongside him. His loyal allies, the few who had stood by his side when everyone else turned away, were breathing heavily, their expressions grim but resolute. They had fought with everything they had, and now, in the quiet aftermath, there was a moment of uneasy peace. The fiancée and her family were safe, hidden away in another part of the castle, but the Vampire King knew that he could not afford to relax. The rogue vampires were only the first wave, and there would be more to come. As his thoughts raced, the waitress approached him, her eyes filled with the same quiet determination that had carried them through the battle. She stood before him, her gaze unwavering. "What now?" she asked, her voice calm, yet filled with anticipation. The Vampire King didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, as if weighing his next words carefully. She had proven herself in the heat of battle, had been a crucial ally in the fight, and now he knew he had to rely on her again. There was a bond between them now, forged in the fire of war, a bond that went beyond mere gratitude. "We rebuild," he said finally, his voice low and resolute. "We strengthen our defenses, we gather our remaining allies, and we prepare for what's to come." The waitress nodded, her expression softening. "And the others? The ones who betrayed you?" The Vampire King's jaw tightened at the mention of those who had turned against him, those who had allied with the rogue vampires in a bid for power. His eyes darkened with anger. "They will pay for their treachery," he said, his voice cold and filled with vengeance. "But first, we need to solidify our position. The factions that remain hidden in the shadows won't stop until they have what they want." "And what do they want?" the waitress asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King turned to face her fully, his eyes hardening with the weight of his knowledge. "They want control," he said. "Power over this kingdom, over everything I've built. They want to tear down everything I've fought for and replace it with their own vision of what this world should be." He paused, his gaze distant as he considered the gravity of the situation. "But they underestimate me. And they underestimate you." The waitress met his gaze with a steady, unwavering look. She had earned his trust, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she still held some piece of the puzzle back, something about her past that she wasn't sharing. But now wasn't the time to ask. Now was the time to act. "We need to gather those who are still loyal to me," the Vampire King said, his voice firm. "We need to strengthen the alliances we have and create new ones. The more we can unite, the stronger we'll be." "And what about the city?" the waitress asked. "The people are frightened. They've seen the destruction. They've seen the chaos. We can't just rebuild without their support." The Vampire King nodded in agreement. "The people are the key, but they won't support us unless they see that we're strong. We'll show them that we have control. We'll protect them, give them hope, and in return, they'll stand with us." "It won't be easy," she said softly. "There's still so much distrust, so many who will try to tear us apart." The Vampire King's expression hardened. "I know, but we have no choice. This is the only way forward." He turned away from her, his thoughts swirling. His kingdom was fractured, but he wouldn't let it crumble. He had fought too long and too hard for everything he had built. He had bled for it, and he wasn't about to let it slip away now. "We'll start with the city," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "We'll show them we're not just kings and queens in name. We'll prove it through action. We'll rebuild, and we'll stand strong together." The waitress didn't speak for a moment, then nodded. Then I'll do my part, she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. But we must move quickly. The longer we wait, the more we risk. The factions won't just sit back and watch. They'll strike when they're ready. The Vampire King turned to her, his eyes meeting hers once again. And we'll be ready. We have to be. Together, they had faced the first wave of the enemy. Together, they had proven that they could stand against the darkness. And together, they would rebuild, stronger than before. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but the Vampire King was ready. He had a kingdom to protect, and he would do whatever it took to keep it. With the Waitress by his side, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The war was not over, but the fight had just begun, and the Vampire King would stop at nothing to win it. The Vampire King stood at the edge of the city's darkened walls, his mind heavy with the decisions that loomed ahead. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The rogue faction had been defeated for now, but their influence continued to spread, like a virus infecting everything they touched. His kingdom was vulnerable, and every ally he had fought so hard to protect was now at risk. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and ash from the recent destruction, a reminder of the battle they had just survived. Yet the real danger was still out there. He knew that he couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to act swiftly, decisively. With the city now on edge, it was time to rebuild the trust he had almost lost. We can't stay here, the Waitress said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. She stood next to him, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting the worst. They'll come after us again. The factions, the ones who have been lurking in the shadows. They'll make their move. The Vampire King turned to her, his expression hardening. I know, but we need to secure the city first. We can't afford another attack like the one we just faced. The weight of his words hung heavily between them. He knew the risk. The city was not just a home for him. It was the heart of his kingdom, the seat of his power. Without it, there would be nothing left to protect. We'll make sure the people know we're still in control, the Vampire King continued. We need to reassure them, to show them we're not vulnerable. The Waitress nodded, though her expression remained tight with concern. The people need a leader, she said softly. They need to know that someone is watching over them. Someone strong. That's why we need to act fast, the Vampire King replied. The longer we wait, the more we risk. But we can't do this alone. We need allies, she agreed. There are those who still remain loyal to you, but they won't come to your aid unless they see your strength. They need to believe that you can protect them. The Vampire King looked out over the darkened city, his mind calculating the risks and the moves he needed to make. Then we will show them our strength, he said, his voice hardening with determination. But first, we need to deal with the traitors. Those who betrayed me, who sided with the rogue faction. They must be dealt with before they can cause any more damage. The Waitress stepped closer, her gaze steady. And what do you plan to do with them? She asked. The Vampire King's eyes narrowed. They will answer for their betrayal, he said coldly. And those who remain loyal will see that justice is done. The weight of his words hung in the air as they both stood in silence, contemplating the path ahead. You'll need to move quickly, the Waitress said. Time is running out. The factions are already regrouping. They're organizing their forces, and they won't wait for you to make your next move. I know, the Vampire King replied, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. That's why we'll move first. We'll take the fight to them. As he spoke, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and his senses heightened. He turned to face the source of the sound, and soon the figure of a messenger emerged from the shadows, carrying a message that would change everything. My lord, the messenger said, bowing slightly before presenting a scroll sealed with a wax emblem. This just arrived. It's from one of your allies in the east. The Vampire King took the scroll, breaking the seal with a swift motion. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, and his face hardened as he read. It's worse than we thought, he muttered under his breath. The Waitress moved closer, her curiosity piqued. What is it? She asked. The Vampire King looked up, his eyes dark. The enemy has already begun mobilizing on all fronts. They've secured a stronghold in the east, and they're planning an attack. If we don't act now, they'll have the advantage. Then we have no time to waste, the Waitress said, her voice firm. We'll need to strike quickly before they can solidify their position. The Vampire King nodded, his resolve hardening. We gather our forces, he said. We march at dawn. The sun had not yet risen when the vampire king and his loyal allies began their march toward the eastern stronghold. The city had barely stirred, the streets empty as the weight of the coming battle loomed over them. As they made their way through the city, the vampire king could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Every step they took brought them closer to an uncertain future, one that would test everything they had fought for. The road ahead would be difficult, but the vampire king knew that there was no turning back now. The enemy had made their move, and it was time to show them that he would not go down without a fight. He would reclaim his kingdom. He would protect his people, and he would not let anyone take what was rightfully his. The time for waiting was over. Now, the real battle would begin. The vampire king stood at the threshold of the battlefield, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first light of dawn was breaking through the darkened sky. The air was thick with tension, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble with the weight of what was to come. His heart beat steady, but his mind raced with the knowledge that this final confrontation would determine the fate of everything he had fought for. The rogue faction was gathering their forces, but he was no longer the only one preparing for war. His allies had rallied to his side, each one ready to fight to protect the kingdom that had been built through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He turned to face the small group of loyal vampires gathered around him. Their eyes were filled with the same resolve, the same determination that burned in his own chest. They had all seen the destruction the rogue vampires had caused, and now they were ready to make sure that it would end here, today. The waitress stood beside him, her expression as calm as ever, but he could see the fire in her eyes. She had been with him through it all, and now, together, they were about to face the final battle. "We're ready," she said softly, her voice steady. "We've trained, we've prepared. We know what we're up against." The vampire king nodded, his gaze flicking to the horizon once more. "The rogue faction thinks they can take everything from me, but they've underestimated us. Today, we show them that we will not fall. We fight for this kingdom, for our people, and for everything we've built." The air seemed to hum with power, the tension building to a fever pitch as the final moment drew nearer. The first strike would come soon, and when it did, they would have to move quickly and decisively. There was no room for mistakes. "Once we engage," the vampire king continued, his voice low and commanding, "we don't stop until they're defeated. We fight as one, and we win as one." His words were met with nods of agreement. His allies were ready. They knew the stakes. The vampire king could feel the weight of their trust in him, and it fueled his resolve. The rogue vampires were strong, but they were not invincible. They had come for his throne, but they would leave with nothing but defeat. The first wave of attackers appeared, emerging from the shadows of the distant trees, their eyes glowing red with malice. The vampire king could feel the power in the air, their dark energies stirring as they approached. His grip tightened on his sword. "Now," he ordered, his voice sharp. The battle began with a deafening clash. The vampire king and his allies met the rogue vampires head-on, their swords flashing in the dim light of dawn. The sound of steel meeting steel echoed across the battlefield, the force of each strike reverberating through the ground beneath them. The rogue vampires fought with brutal precision, but the vampire king's forces were faster, stronger. They had the advantage of unity, of fighting for something greater than themselves. The fight raged on, the air thick with the scent of blood and the sharp sting of magic. The vampire king moved through the chaos with lethal grace, his sword cutting down one enemy after another. His mind was clear, focused solely on the battle before him. But in the back of his mind, he knew that the rogue faction's leader was still out there, and he had to face him. The rogue leader had been the mastermind behind this war, and it was time to end it. As the vampire king cleaved through the last of the rogue vampires, he spotted the leader in the distance, standing alone, watching the battle unfold. His eyes burned with an unnatural fire, his posture cold and calculating. This was it, the final confrontation. The vampire king's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way toward the leader. Every step was measured, each movement deliberate. The leader's eyes flicked toward him, a cruel smile curling at the corners of his lips. "You're too late," the rogue leader said, his voice cold, mocking. "This war was never about you. It was about your weakness." The vampire king's jaw tightened. "It's over. Your reign ends today." Without another word, The vampire king lunged at the rogue leader, his sword raised high. The two met in the center of the battlefield with a clash that could be heard for miles. Their swords locked, and the force of their collision sent shockwaves through the air. The rogue leader's power was immense, his dark energy radiating like a storm. But the vampire king's resolve was stronger. He had fought for this moment for centuries, and he would not let it slip away. The two vampires fought with everything they had, their strikes fast and brutal. But the vampire king's speed, his centuries of experience, gave him the edge. With a final, powerful blow, he drove his sword through the rogue leader's chest, piercing his heart. The rogue leader's eyes widened in disbelief as he collapsed to the ground, his body disintegrating into dust before it even hit the earth. The battlefield fell silent, the roar of battle replaced by an eerie stillness. The vampire king stood over the fallen leader, his sword still raised, his chest heaving with exertion. The war was over. The rogue faction had been defeated. The kingdom was safe, for now. The vampire king turned to face his allies, his eyes sweeping over the faces of those who had fought beside him. They were battered, bloodied, but they were alive. They had won. "We did it," the waitress said, her voice soft but filled with relief. The vampire king nodded, his expression grim. "This battle is over," he said, his voice steady. "But the fight for this kingdom will never truly end. We must remain vigilant. There will always be threats, always forces that seek to tear us down. But together, we will face them, and we will keep fighting." He turned to look out over the city, his kingdom, the people he had sworn to protect. The sun had fully risen now, casting its light over the land. It was a new day, and the vampire king knew that this was just the beginning. The future was uncertain, but he was ready for whatever it would bring. He had a kingdom to rebuild, and he would do it, one battle at a time.